welcome, welcome. This is going to be more of a conversation, I think, rather than a very formal session, because the whole point of this is to give you as much information that you can glean from the experiences that Jeff has had in a fantastic career, which is ongoing career, as exec producer, screenwriter. There's an awful lot in there. But it's also interesting to look at the early days before we get into what's a lovely selection of clips to show you, but also we will talk about some of those clips and those shows as well. So I want to start, Jeff, if I could, by just going through a little bit of sort of a potted history of where you started, how you started, and what influenced you in those early days to move towards the career you've got.
First thing to say is that I didn't have I suspect everyone out there has a thing in them that they think this area and this industry touches something and you have a connection with it. I didn't think I would be able to earn a living out of it, and so I kind of buried it a bit, and it came out gradually. But I think the theme throughout my entire career has been stories. So the first proper job that I had was as a journalist. I trained properly to be a journalist on a local paper, and I thought about this recently, and actually all my life, what I've been doing is taking raw material, stories, giving those stories a beginning and a middle and an end, and then presenting them, be that in an article in a newspaper, or be that in factual programs where I started in television, or be that in a screenplay and a drama. So it's stories and dealing with raw material and processing that and shaping it and polishing it and researching, I should say, comes before that, and then presenting that story. So it's dealing with stories.
Okay, we should probably touch on a bit about sort of the differences between sort of the journalistic route and then other routes that you can go into drama, because some people go this like script editing or production. Did you find that quite were you unusual in doing what you were doing, or is that quite normal? Or
I think I think what happened with me, the great advantage I had was that if I go back a bit, when I was working as a journalist, really the same processes that I apply to my work now were in place then, which is research. So as a reporter on a local paper, I'd be given a story, and then you go and find out as much as you can about that story, and that maybe, obviously, if it's a crime, you're speaking to the police, speaking to victims, or whatever, and you're building out from that starting point. But it's thorough research, and that in my career now gives me the confidence. I think everything needs to be built from strong foundations. So if the research is in place, the screenwriting process, I've found, tends to become easier. And this is even if it's a fictional piece or a factual piece. Either way, I think my approach has been a really strong bed of research to build from. What happened to me was I worked in factual programs in television. So I was working on something which no one would remember because you're all too young, which was like a London version of the One Show. And so it was an hour long, and it was like a magazine show, and there were like 3 or 4 little 5-minute, what were called items, about the funny side of life in London. And I was a researcher, and I would work on 1 or sometimes 2 of those a week. And as my career went forward, I moved to being a producer and then an editor of that show. And then I was given a chance to work on a crime show. And I've devised a format where there was like a 15-minute segment at the end of it, which was the story of how a major crime was solved. And that was my first dip into drama. It was a dramatization, so it was voiceover and actors acting out acting out scenes and the story. And so I'd kind of dipped a toe. And I found that I had an aptitude to write. Not everyone will. I've never directed, and I take great thrill in working with really brilliant directors. And I think in my mind, where I stand on that is, I think if I can say to myself that I can do this as well as anybody else, then go for it. And I don't feel that in directing terms. I think there are people whose mind works better that way. And as Carolyn said, there'll be those amongst you who don't harbour writing ambitions. You may be producers, you may be directors, you may be screenwriters, you may be script editors, you may be whatever. But I still think the same principles apply, which is that even as a producer, if you have an idea and you think this could be a drama, even if you're not going to write it yourself and that you're going to then work with a writer, still the same process applies. If you're part of generating as much research about that story, and if you're able to provide your writer with as many different points of stimulus, different people, different angles on the story, you're going to be doing your job as a producer better, because your writer's going to have much more to draw on. And it may even, in some instances, require you to force a writer to not limit his or her horizons too soon, and keep providing them with material, and keep forcing them to look at it in different ways.
I think what we'll do now is we'll show a clip, because it'd be quite useful for you to use this as an example of kind of how you ended up with the project that you did. But Pierrepoint, which I think was 2005, fascinating story about the last hangman. I'm going to just flag up, I do hope you've all had very strong coffees before you watch this clip, because there's quite a large element of nudity in it, which is a bit early in the morning, but there we go. But, and afterwards, feel free if you want to ask Jeff anything about any particular elements as we're going along. We have two people wandering around with microphones. If I can see your arm go up, I will obviously let you ask a question if possible. We'll keep the thing moving, but we've got a lot of clips to get through as well, because there's lots to talk about. But let's have a look at the clip first.
Oh, now, am I mistaken? Did the prisoner speak on the scaffold?
Not that I was aware of, sir.
Funny. I thought I heard her say something.
No, sir.
She did say something, didn't she?
Aye. She asked for a god. That's not to do with me or anybody else. Between her and her executioner. When I walk into that cell, I leave Albert Pierrepoint outside. I never mixed the two. I have to be clear about these things. People are always wondering whether it's possible to take a life and not affect you. I've written bloody books on it.
What do they say?
I don't know. Not me taking the life, is it? The government wants these people executing, not you or me. That's the way I see it. But I never concern myself with what they've done. Doesn't matter to me. Right, bring her down. Grand. Right. Nice and clean. Second and third vertebrae. You see, we don't hurt him, Kirky. Instant. A professional job, well done. She wouldn't have felt anything. All right, lower her down. That's it, all right. All right, take her away.
It's not so much the execution. It's this bit I hate, Albert. Why can't they get someone from the mortuary to do this?
Because they wouldn't take care of her, would they? She paid the price. She's innocent now.
Jeff, how did that start? Did you find the story? Did somebody come to you with the story?
I think it started with Ruth Ellis at the back of my mind. There was a really brilliant film called Dance with a Stranger in the 80s. And then I think, if I'm honest, I think it was Ray Winston that suggested, and originally he was going to play Albert, but it didn't work out, and Tim played that role brilliantly. But where it really started was so I read lots of material about the life of Albert Pierrepoint, and also quite a lot of contemporary newspaper articles, which were very illuminating throughout his career. And I started to pick on this theme. When he after the execution, he there was this phrase I remember. He said, "They deserve to be treated with gentle dignity. They've paid the price. They're innocent now," meaning that a person who's been executed, their mortal remains are innocent because they've, it's like someone coming out of prison. They've paid their penalty, and the more I dug into it, I'm just recalling it now. The key thing was that thing that Albert had, and he said, "It's not me that's in the execution chamber." Mm-hmm. So it threw up this question of, can a human being take another human being's life and not be affected by it, which was what Albert's contention was. And we discovered that towards the end of his career, Albert, that wall had been broken because Albert hung somebody that he knew socially. Uh-huh. So that, and then what I also knew was at the end of his life, Albert went, to use for the vernacular, he went mad. He was exactly. Mm. And my feelings about capital punishment were affected by the piece because I started out as your age, I was anti, and then as I got older and had children, I remember the Soham murders, thinking Huntley ought to have hung for taking away the lives of those two girls, and then made this film, and I'm anti now because primarily that you cannot ask a human being to take away another human being's life. Mm-hmm. That's where so that was the kind of brew that it came from. But it was a great example of more and more and more research. We read about other executioners, and you got into the psychology more. And
the grimness of some of the, because it's quite interesting that you Rose, the Wests, Rose and Fred West, you went on to write about them. Did you did you think, I'm going to explore worlds that people don't know enough about and probably shy away from?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I always think the thing about Pierrepoint was it was a story about life, which was that in the midst of the hundreds of people he'd executed, his essential spirit could not be extinguished. In the end, his conscience said, "Albert, you've killed all these people. You aren't a machine." I don't start out to think, what's the most gruesome story I could possibly tell? But as you probably all come across in your studies, the essence of drama is conflict. It's true. And if you are looking for the greatest amount of conflict, it will be, for me, it has been in these very big stories and very big themes. But the piece you're talking about, Appropriate Adult, brings into play something else that is a theme for me, which is the best stories, I think, are those where you can put yourself in it. And if we take Appropriate Adult, which was about the West murders, the Cromwell Street murders, it's a good example. There are a number of ways into that story. Perhaps the kind of macabre Hollywood version. When I'm saying Hollywood, I mean there was a Tarantino film about forgotten what it was called now, Natural Born Killers, I think it was called, where you can try and place yourself on the shoulders of Fred and Rose West. So there's this couple, and they've got this sordid, evil, murderous sex life, which involves killing victims, and eventually it looks like they're going to get found out, and there's tension. So you could approach it from that point of view. I personally think I don't think there's a lot to be learnt from that, because I don't really think most people want to get inside the heads of serial killers. So therefore, the approach I took was Janet Leach. And if anyone's familiar with that story, Janet Leach was a social worker who, by chance, was assigned to Frederick West when he was being interviewed by the police. The police didn't know that he'd killed loads and loads of victims. He was being questioned about the disappearance of his daughter. And he couldn't read or write, so belt and braces, they gave an appropriate adult to sit in, to look out for Fred's interests. And that was how your mum, your sister, your auntie, your wife was in the room with a person such as Fred West. So it allows the audience to think, that could be me, that could be someone I know. And what would I do in that situation?
Should we see a clip?
On one condition. You tell the police who else you've killed.
All right.
In writing, so you can't backtrack. Get Mr. Ogden in. Mr. Ogden.
Yes?
Mr. West wants to make a statement.
Saying what?
Who else he's killed.
Really? Well, what exactly do you want to say?
Go on, Fred.
Janet, come and sit here. So what should we put?
Go on.
I, Frederick West, authorise my solicitor...
Authorise my solicitor.
Howard Ogden.
Howard Ogden.
To advise Superintendent Bennett...
Superintendent Bennett.
Of...
Of, a further 8 killings.
8.
All right, 9.
Well, is it 8 or 9?
Shall we just put approx?
That's it, approx. Good girl.
Of a further 9 approx killings.
Just a couple of points there. So what was happening was Fred knew that he was going to, these murders were going to be uncovered and that he was never going to get out of prison. And so Janet, in a sense, was his last victim. I don't mean he killed her, but in the sense that he forced her to come under his spell. And he said, I'll only tell about other murders if you're sitting there and you come and visit me. And so he was controlling her in that sense. The other thing is, if you look, there is in the archives, Fred West's confession, and it says exactly that. I, Frederick West, wish to inform Superintendent Bennett of a further 9 (approx) killings. And so if Neil Mackay was the screenwriter, that was me working as a producer on that piece. So, but we talked about it, and I said, how did you come to approx? And we asked Janet, and she didn't have a particularly clear memory. It was just, but I thought you need that we need to put that down, because never be afraid of humour. I mean, some I watched and there was some smiles, because even though it's horrible, he's talking about the deaths of 9 victims, there's still something ridiculous about saying 8, or is it 9? Let's just put 9 approx. And it's an example of why I'm fascinated in factual stories and things that have happened, because locked in the DNA of those stories is a complete avoidance of cliche. You wouldn't make that up, is the clearest way of putting it. Who on earth would think of a line of dialogue about 8, 9 approx? And yet you take this jewel from real life and find its right place and where it fits in the story and what it's saying. And it was to do in that instance about Fred further pulling Janet into his orbit like a spider catching something in its web.
It's fascinating. As you say, it's probably, you couldn't make it up, actually. It's sort of... Would anybody like to ask Jeff anything on what you've seen so far? Otherwise, yeah. Can I see a... No, okay. All right, well, I'm going to move on because we have some more to show. But this, again, is another set of characters, isn't it? This is about Ronnie Biggs' wife. And could you just give us a bit of background to this story? This came about because she told, this is basically the, well, no, I'll let you explain it because you're better explaining it than me, but if you could just give us a bit of background on how the story came about.
Okay.
Then we'll have a look at it.
As those out there that aspire to work in drama, in whatever capacity, but I suppose specifically writers, producers, perhaps directors, I've always sort of had this family of ideas that are in the back of my mind that and you've got to have more than one, because I learnt very early in my career, and Carolyn would probably identify with this, which is if you put all your eggs in one basket, if something happens, and there's a good chance you will be stymied, it won't happen, the terrible feeling of dejection and deflation can only be alleviated by, well, at least I've got that. So I've always had a number of ideas on the go at any given point in my career. The Great Train Robbery, and specifically Charmian Biggs, was one of them. I saw a documentary years and years ago, and she was talking about how, this is how it started, she was talking about how when she was living in Australia and Ron was on the run in Rio, nobody knew where he was, their eldest son died in a car crash. And she spoke so movingly about it in this documentary. And she was so, also when she talked about Ron, was so clearly, and she was in her 60s now, so clearly still in love with him, that it just made an enormous impression on me. But I filed it away because I was doing other things. And then the anniversary, the 50th anniversary of the Great Train Robbery was approaching. It was in 2013. And I suddenly became aware of, in the industry, people talking about maybe doing a great train robbery and blah, blah, blah. And I thought, okay, if I don't really go for this project now, it'll be gone.
So it's interesting that timing,
yeah,
what's happening in the news can affect when you push a particular project forward.
Yeah. And there have been projects out there where I've had them, and then with a horrible feeling, you read someone's doing effectively the idea that you've had for a long time. So I thought, we've got to go for it now. And I'd spent really, there's a lot of thinking time. If I think about an idea today, even if I went as quickly as I possibly could, it wouldn't be on screens for a year and a half. Is something that's fresh today going to seem worth it in a year and a half's time? So there's always, don't rush. But that was a bit ridiculous. But so I had a way in, which was Charmian. And again, a bit like Janet Leach, it works, again, from the point of view of me. That could be me. I'm not a great train robber, but I could be in a position where my partner comes in and says, I've done something terrible. And then what do? Do you report your the father of your children to the police. What do you do? And it's a great dilemma. And that was the starting point for Mrs. Biggs. And I'll talk about it after the clip.
Yeah, so let's have a look at the clip. Yeah.
I might not have her body, but I've given you 3 kids. I'm equal facially, and I know I'm better company.
It isn't a competition. She's just helping us out.
Seems to me she's got designs on becoming the new Mrs. Biggs.
Anyway, it's not the perfect, but the imperfect have need of love.
Don't you dare quote Oscar Wilde to me.
Well, if you must know, I can barely stand the sight of her.
I remember in Paris. I tried to tell you something. It's important. I got pregnant. I had an abortion.
Yeah, I guess it was something like that.
It was a stupid mistake, and I've had a long time to regret it. But you were right when you said it didn't matter. Tell me this is the same, that this baby won't make a difference.
It's a means to an end. That's all.
When are we going to spend some time together? I've got so much making up to do.
There's a party tomorrow night. We can spend some time together there.
Just a line at the beginning of that, which is, again, this thing I was saying about avoidance of cliche and original dialogue. I remember Charmian saying it. She was talking about the woman that Ron Biggs had got pregnant, and she said she might have a better body than me, but I'm the equal of her facially. It was just a funny way of expressing herself. Charmian. So what? Obviously, the centerpiece to Mrs. Biggs is the Great Train Robbery. The audience and me I was the screenwriter in that piece. I knew I was going to build to and from the Great Train Robbery. It was going to happen somewhere. I think it was in episode 2. It was originally a 2-parter, but it grew. And it was because Charmian's story was an odyssey. I remember writing and thinking, just roughly, I'm thinking, well, episode 1 is going to have the Great Train Robbery, and yet in episode 2 is going to be Fallout. And I'd written the first episode. They barely got married, there was so much going on. And ITV were very good. I convinced them that it would sustain. But the point I was going to make was she talks then about getting pregnant and having an abortion. So I spent many hours with Charmian going over the story, and then you go over it again and again, and then you read books, and then you think you know it, and then you go over it again with her. And that's how things like I'm the equal of her facially, that's where that comes from, because she'll suddenly, the more times you go through it with her, sometimes the memory will spark and she'll say something, and then you've got your moment. But during the course of that, I established a really good rapport with Charmian. I got on with her brilliantly, and she was a really intelligent woman, and I told her right from the beginning, I said, I remember as a kid, my mum and dad seeing her on the telly and saying, during reports of the Great Train Robbery, she must have known. And she said that's happened to her all her life, and she didn't, is the answer. But she told me about, so she was 24, 25, she'd had 2 children, and her husband came home and he told her he'd been away chopping down trees in the New Forest to get some extra money. And then she realises he's been involved in the Great Train Robbery, and he confesses it. And she says, what happens? He's arrested, cut a long story short, and he's given like 30 years in prison. So and in those days there was no parole. This was the 60s. There was no parole. So she's now a 24-year-old woman with 2 small children, and she's not going to see her husband until she's nearly 60. And we were talking about it, and she said, I couldn't handle it, and she weakened, and there was a young guy who was a friend of a friend, and they went out and had some fun, and she needed some, she needed some self-esteem, an injection of self-esteem, so she had a relationship with him, and she got pregnant. And she said, and I said, what did you, she said, well, can you imagine Ron Biggs in prison being told your wife's up the duff? And it's not, obviously it's not you that's...
Yep.
So she had a backstreet abortion, which was an agonising and horrendous process as well. She told me about it and said, this is not for the film, this is not for the series, but I just want to tell you what it was like for me. I want to give you an insight into how my state of mind was at that point. So I obviously asked questions, and we went through it, and I found it fascinating and heartrending, really. It was upsetting. And sorry, I'm just remembering, she died just before, around this time last year, and I had a sudden wave of... But about 2 months later, we were talking and talking. She says, I want you to put it in at the abortion. And one of the problems was she had a family in Australia, and she had a granddaughter who didn't know anything about her past. They kept it from her. She'd see pictures of Grandad, Ronald Biggs, but wouldn't know who he was. And she was about 10, I think, her granddaughter at the time. And so really it was still a scar in the family. And when she said, I want it to go in, I thought to myself, with your family background, and she said, it happened. And she said, we don't need to be afraid of the truth. It happened. And so I didn't assume, and I said, okay, well, I will include it, but, let's talk about it again when it's in. And she never had a second thought about it. And just to quickly rush to the end of that story, it was a massive healing process in her family. She felt as if people could look at what had happened to her, and she could say, this is what happened. This is what I went through. I don't need to be ashamed anymore. Her name was Brent, because the name Biggs had such a stigma. And she said, but I felt as if it was too late to change back, but I felt as if I could go into the hairdressers and say, my name's Mrs. Biggs. So it was...
huge. It's also that getting to the emotional truth, which you obviously managed to do so brilliantly. Did you find when you were talking to it was obviously ITV, wasn't it, the broadcaster? Did you find, because you said that it became longer, it became bigger as you discovered more. How does that relationship work with the broadcaster? Were you able to say, look, I'm sorry, I know you've said that, I know I've agreed with you that I'm doing this, well, I need more, I've got to do. How does that work, that relationship?
Well, it's a function of building up a relationship over a period of time and having done other projects that have worked. So I'm aware that, it's
easier as you get established.
Exactly, yeah. It's easier as you go on. Yeah. But what would have happened was I would have shown them the first episode and said, here it is. So they can see for themselves that the story's not dawdling. I'm not fannying around spending an hour on stuff that's not interesting, And then, in fact, I think what happened was, I think it was going to be a 3-parter. It was going to be a 2 times 90. Then it was 4 times 1. And in the end, it was 5 episodes, but the first and last episodes were 90 minutes. So it was a really... I just think I was lucky.
Very unusual.
Very, very lucky that it was... What happens in television is sometimes you get World Cup years. So there's the World Cup is the Soccer World Cup or the Rugby World Cup, every couple of years, fills up the schedule and sucks a load of money. And then you get the other years when suddenly they need more content and drama. These things are happening, but they're going to say next year is the Olympics and that will be the BBC. So 2016, is probably going to be a good year for drama because there's not so much sport in the ITV schedule. There will be on the BBC. So it was a function of that. We just got lucky that it was one of those years where they wanted content.
I'm going to look across the room now in case anybody would like to ask anything before I move on to film world. Okay, over there, there's a lady. We'll just get a microphone to you. Just wait 1 second.
Hi.
This is absolutely fascinating, and I'm actually more interested in how you capture all this research. How do you record it? Do you write it down? And then how do you unpack it to then write your script?
Yeah, it's a good question. So my process would be this. Now, if we take Mrs. Biggs as an example, after the initial contact with Charmian, a producer that works with me, that I've worked with a lot, Quadjo Dejan, went to Melbourne and spent a week with her, and he recorded everything, his conversations with her. And what happened was I also went about 4 or 5 months later and spent a couple of weeks with her and repeated the process. But initially, I was rowing. My keep fit regime then was rowing, and so I'd put this interview in and I'd row and listen, and then read. There have been half a dozen books about the Great Train Robbery and Ronald Biggs. And what's interesting is you read one and then you read another one and you think, okay, there's a lot of crossover, but I didn't know that little bit. And actually that's given me an insight into this bit, and just little bits are adding to your knowledge. But to answer the question more directly, what I'll do is take it in, keep chipping away, keep reading, doing other things, doing other projects at the same time, but keep it going. And then finally, you kind of reach what I would call, for want of a better expression, critical mass. There comes a point when you finally think about, in my case, physically writing it myself, or if as a producer, you think about handing it over to a writer, and you think, I am on top of this now. You know, I kind of, every way I look in this story, I think I know where I'm going. And then I'll start to do a skeleton. I will, okay, it starts here, and there's a good example of this coming up. I think we're going to play a Cilla clip, aren't we? And I'll tell you about that in a minute. But you know, what's the ending? Where does it end is a great discipline. And in Mrs. Biggs, there were about 4 or 5 different endings. You had to pick one. What's the ending? And then I'll start to get a skeleton. It goes from here to here to here to here. You know, literally, they meet. She has to defy her family to be with Ron. He gets her to steal from work. They go on the run. They're caught. Shame. They get married in spite of her family. You know, they start a family. And then things are going well. And then they need some money to buy a house, and he goes to see his friend. Can you lend me some money? No, I can't lend you any money, but I'm about to do this big job. Do you want to berth on that job? Do you want a part of that job? No, I'm not involved in that anymore. And then, and then the Great Train Robbery, and away you go. And then go back and flesh that skeleton out, build it up a bit more. What do we know about that bit? Bit more. And then when I come to actually write, Peter Kay, who I worked with recently, calls it the colouring in. You've got imagine a picture in outline, and now you're going to colour it in. The colouring in, the actual writing, the actual dialogue. The more you've gone over and over and over, the easier that process becomes. And as a producer, if you're not actually writing yourself, the same thing. You work in the same way. I would urge you to get a writer to give you a sense of where his head's going, because he or she could charge off down one road, and it's not the story you want to tell. So try to fit together and refine and work and go over and over, and then it's hold off the actual draft until you're completely sure that you're on top of that story.
It's quite interesting because it's a similar discipline on the long-running dramas when you have the storyline, which is the scene 1 is this, scene 2 is that, scene 3, before you get into dialogue and characters.
Yeah.
And it's a very similar system. What's really interesting about it is when you look at people on the long-running shows, the people that used to do that before they turned to writing themselves. So you had Kay Mellor, Paul Abbott, Russell T Davies. They all learned the storylining bit first, and I think it's a really invaluable first stage before you write. Then you can concentrate on character. And
I was going to say, trust your memory as well, because I surprised myself then when I did that skeleton. That was it. I suddenly realised, oh yeah, that, and that was 3 years ago. And I wouldn't say I'd got particularly a greater memory than anyone else, but I think it's to do with interest. I think if you really have gone through the story, things stick out because you want to remember them, because you think, yeah, that was great when that happened and then that happened. So trust your memory. In other words, I suppose it's like, I didn't go to university, but I did A-levels. And it's that, if you study, if you're interested in the subject and read enough about it, it is there. It will be in your mind.
Any other questions? Has a hand gone up over on this side?
Hi.
I was just wondering about casting in particular, because these are real people. Does that sort of make it more difficult to cast, if that makes sense?
Okay, so good couple of examples here. Sheridan Smith as Charmian Biggs, and Dominic West as Frederick West, and Emily Watson as Janet Leach. So the theme in the casting was always the best actor or actress, not someone who looks like. Looking like does come into it somewhere, but I mean, even in Cilla, Aniron Barnard, who played Bobby Willis, Cilla's boyfriend, husband, could not be darker. It's jet black hair and, beard, dark eyes, and he had to play, his character was blonde and blue-eyed. And nobody blinked an eye when he's on screen as Bobby, because makeup is a brilliant thing. They bleached his hair every 3 days, I think it was, because it was black roots were forcing their way out even. But so always it's performance. So when we cast Mrs. Biggs, we met a couple of dozen actresses for the part of Charmian, and and even that would have been winnowed down. There's the process of a casting director who is part of the production, whose job it is to present possible cast for you. So they would have winnowed down a long list of possibles even before you go to a casting session and read with the actresses for that part. There are certain actors and actresses who you can't really get to read because of the status they've achieved in the industry. But at that point, everyone read for Charmian. The last person we met by pure chance was Sheridan, and she came in and just did the most astonishing audition. Still remember it vividly right to this day. She'd just done, she was at the point in her career where she'd just done Legally Blonde, had a massive hit in the West End. And I expected her to be eyes and teeth and big, and television and film is small. You want small things. But she's just a brilliant actress, and she came in and brought such incredible power to that, just the audition. Dominic West read. Emily Watson didn't. Emily Watson didn't because she's Oscar nominated if she hasn't won an Oscar. And we knew we wanted to go for Emily Watson right from the beginning, because
I was going to say sometimes you can't.
There's a body of work out there, and you know someone.
You know what you're going to get.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so the conversation with Emily Watson was, here's the script, would you be interested in playing Janet? And then she said yes. For Fred West, even though Dominic had some incredible success and still continued to have in his career, but he read for Fred. You know, we got everyone to read for Fred. But Dominic is about 6'2" and slim, and Fred was 5'5" and burly. And they had dark curly hair, I suppose. But even then, it was a wig, you know, that he had. But the long answer, the short answer is, you know, the best in terms of interpretation, not any. That should always be the guiding principle.
Can we talk about Philomena next, which was a huge success in 2013? There was a book. What came in what order? Did you read Martin Sixsmith's book and think, "Oh, this would be fantastic," or what was the right order to get to that point where you were writing the screenplay?
Okay, the process was Martin Sixsmith wrote a book.
Yeah.
Martin is a very esteemed
and respected BBC journalist.
BBC, yeah. He wrote a book. Steve Coogan read a Guardian review of the book, and on the basis of that article about the book, bought an option on the book. What's called an option? Basically you buy a Bagsy a chance at making a film of the book, and then contacted me through a mutual friend, because Steve. He works with his team on Partridge, and so he's sort of written stuff, but doesn't actually write.
And this was a very different type of.
And he wanted to work with someone to write it, and then Christine Langan, who's the head of BBC Film, when he was pitching the idea to her, said, "You don't want to write, you want to rewrite. You want to co-write." And he said, "You're right." He had very strong ideas about how he wanted to do it. And she just, you know, I'm really grateful. She put me and Steve together. I sort of knew him, but I'd never worked with him.
Okay.
And I'd worked with other people in the past, and then we fitted together. So but the point, though, I'm trying to get to a punchline, which was, so at the point we met, he pitched Philomena to me, and he said that the big idea he had, which was bang on, was to make Martin a character in his own story. So if you know the story of Philomena, it's a little old Irish lady who had a child taken away from her in shame in 50s Ireland, and then spent her life trying to find him, and was aided in this by this urbane London journalist, Knightsbridge resident. You know, you can see the two unlikely, the odd couple coming together. And Steve, so Martin didn't put himself in his book, he wrote it in the third person. And Steve said, this should be Martin Sixsmith and Philomena together trying to find the son as an odd couple. And at one point I said to him, "You haven't read Martin's book, have you?" No, he hadn't. He still hadn't read the book. I think he did by the end, but he kind of knew what he wanted. In fact, Martin's book, although it was very interesting, wasn't. If anyone's seen the film and read the book, the two aren't really. There's not a big crossover, because Martin's book is mostly about the life of the son in America.
I suppose you could call it a kind of inspired by sort of thing. Well, so it sort of it helps have the debate with everybody about what the story is, but it's not.
The film wouldn't have happened if Martin hadn't written his book, for sure.
Yeah. Okay, let's have a look at a clip.
We should look at him, Martin.
Oh, God, yes. Nothing. You know, comparably handsome.
Wait.
What?
Yeah? You know that?
What's wrong?
You went to Ireland. You went to Ross Cray.
Yeah, I took him. He was looking for you, Philomena.
That nun, I saw her at Ross Cray.
Sister Hildegard.
She's older now, but that was definitely her.
They always told me they didn't know where Anthony was.
But They told us that they couldn't find you.
Come on, I got you.
They said that you had abandoned him as a baby.
She's been looking for him. She spent her whole life trying to find him.
I did not abandon my child.
He's there now.
What do you mean?
I had this huge standoff with his father. He wanted him buried in the U.S., but it was your son's dying wish. You know, he said he wanted to go home. He's buried at Russ Cray.
Hugely powerful scene. How did you find this crossing over from TV into film, two different worlds? Because they do tend to keep themselves very separate, don't they? How did you find that?
Well, I mean, Pierrepoint was a film, and I did a thing years ago called Essex Boys. But the point was, it wasn't as front of house as Philomena. For me, the process was exactly the same as everything else I'd done in the rest of my career, which was a huge amount of research. That scene was when I was talking about structure. I've realised this has happened to me quite a lot. So it must be a thing that I search for when I'm working on stuff, which is, how does it end? Because I always feel as if, you know, I was talking about the great train robbery being in the middle of Mrs. Biggs. You know, I knew I was building to it, and I knew what was going to happen after it. And that's great. But another massively strong way to go into writing something is where are you aiming for? What do you want the ending to be? And it was the discovery, which wasn't obvious. It seemed so right there. But, we read and talked to Philomena until we thought, no, there it is. The answer's right in front of your nose. And it was all the while she'd been looking for him, he'd been looking for her. And that's such a simple, powerful thing to happen. So the process was, I met Philomena, I met her daughter Jane, Martin, read Martin's book, went to the US, spoke to those people involved in the search for Anthony, and refined the process over and over and over again, read. And then a lot of time, Steve and I, on the skeleton thing, we spent a huge amount of time on that, refining and refining and refining. And in the end, I can remember, we thought we'd written the most fantastic first draft. We thought, this is it. And Judi Dench was really interested in it. I think Steve had pitched what it was to her, and she said, yes, that really sounds interesting. And she struggles with her eyesight now. She has macular degeneration, so she sees, but reading's difficult. So she said, would you come and read it to me? So I thought, great, off he goes. And he came back and he went, it's great, and it's fine. He said, well, we've got to cut it. He said, because he was out of the blocks and he'd read about 40 or 50 pages and thought, this is going great. And then he gets to like the 80-page mark and he's thinking, there's still 40 to go. So it was reading long, put it that way. Writing with him was a very interesting process as well, because I was the keyboard Nazi, and he wanted to, he's a brilliant mimic, so it was like being in the room with all the characters. So he'd be his character, he'd be Philomena, he'd be a security guard, he'd be a female journalist, he'd be all of them like that. And the voice, he'd do the voice as well. But the process was for me was no different from writing something for television. Although I suppose it's not completely true. I was aware that, that I could write on a slightly bigger stage. So they go to America and the Lincoln Monument. They go and walk. There's a sequence where they walk around the Lincoln Monument in Washington, because that's where Anthony worked, and so we weren't trying in television. You'll know this. Sometimes instinctively you're thinking, well, I know how much money is in the budget. I've got to tailor that. So I'm kind of subconsciously trying to keep a lid on it. And that lid was off on that. But it's still a modest piece in terms of scale.
And did you find the relationships were different in terms of who were funding the film? Did you have much involvement with that, or did you feel that it was very much something you could control in terms of what was in it and what was out? I mean, obviously, artistically, you know, nobody was there going, "Oh, can't afford that."
Well, you know, yeah, there was a bit. There was a bit of that. There was a bit of that, just on a bigger scale. You know, if you're trying to bring something in for 2 million for 2 hours on television, you're trying to bring it in for under 10 million for a movie, but you're still trying to bring it in. You know, it's still that pressure of we've got to fit to the budget. Real producers in movie terms, which I have to admit to being a fraud, never have done this, but they go out into the marketplace and they get money. They go to people and they say, do you want to invest in this movie? And then they get money from there and they get money from there. Obviously they'll get some money from a studio, but someone like Matthew Vaughn, say, the Kick-Ass producer and director, will have a group of financiers that have funded his last 3 or 4 films who he goes back to. And so he's getting the money to make the film, and they're gambling that it's going to make more money than they put in.
And sometimes you've got a crossover where it's sort of television and film, haven't you? As in there'll be a cinematic release and then it goes to TV because a TV company will have put some money up front.
Yeah,
and
that level of budget.
Real mix, don't you?
Television, the television money will be a significant chunk of
contribution.
It'll be, you know, a sixth, between a sixth and a tenth of the budget. If it's a $50 million movie, then television is going to be a 50th, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, you know, there's scales, but certainly that level of film, it's significant to get the broadcaster involved.
Okay, I'd like to show our last clip because not content with cracking television and film, you've then gone straight into comedy, which is wonderful, and you're now working with Peter, or have been working with Peter Kay and et al. So I'd like to show the last clip if I could, because I want to have time to talk about that, which is the Cradle to Grave. If we could see that one, please.
And so, to the night Colin, my sister Sharon's boyfriend, was coming round to our place for the first time.
I think I'll meet Colin at the top of the street, Mum.
Don't be so silly. You're building it up too much. And I've told your dad not to embarrass you. He won't be wearing them plimsolls, will he?
I don't know, I told him not to.
Hey, where's he going?
That was Sharon.
What with her and Steamboat Bill?
It's called Colin, Dad, and I wish he wasn't coming round now.
He's all right, Sharon. Your father makes a lot of noise, but he ain't gonna do nothing, are you, Fred?
Me? Anyway, where's he taking her? Going to see Joey Hendricks?
Jimi Hendrix, and he's dead.
All right, don't you start. Just because I let you have one orange jacket. What have I told about the way he's turning out?
They're taking Danny out to the theatre, I told you.
Oh, yeah. The one where they all strip off.
Yeah, it's a protest musical. It's political.
Political? Does he know how to get it all out?
It's just paper talk, Fred. It ain't nothing like that.
I hoped it wasn't paper talk. Been thinking about nothing else for the last 2 weeks.
I'll get that.
Fred.
All right, I'm not a crackpot.
Hello, Mr. Baker, I'm Colin.
Well, you can fuck off for a start. What?
I'm Colin.
Sure you're not handicapped?
I've come to pick Sharon up.
No, mate. The only thing you'll be picking up just like that is your nose off the pavement if you don't shift, son.
Oh, leave him alone.
Hello, boy. Don't mind him. He don't mean it.
Don't I? If you think I'm letting a daughter of mine walk out with some soapy fucker in plimsolls, you've got another thing coming.
I'll meet you by the bus stop.
Oi. I'll be up there myself in a couple of minutes. If you're still there, you're going straight under the next double-decker. All right?
God's sake, Dad.
What do you have to go and talk to him like that for?
Well...
We're still going, aren't we?
I mean, another cracking clip, but it's just, what made you suddenly go into comedy when you...
Well, I have actually, it wasn't the first time I've worked. Can I just do it interestingly, how many people watched any of those episodes as they went out? Yeah, a tiny number. It didn't really, with young people. Thank you. I have worked on comedies in the past. I did a thing with Michael Barrymore, and I did a thing with Christmas Lights with Robson Green.
Indeed.
But what happened was, so it's based on the life of Danny Baker, who was, I met him, the first job I ever got in television when I worked on this magazine show. He was a presenter on it, and we got friendly. And in the way that things in this industry do tend to have a cycle to them, I'd stayed friendly with him over the years, and then he got ill. And as part of, while he was recovering, he wrote an autobiography, and we met by chance on holiday. We just realised we were in the same place. Our wives were friendly, and so we met up, and he was telling me about the book, and I thought, right, I'll get a copy of that because I'll be in it. And so I got back from the holiday, went to the book, got it, bookshop, went to the index, and thought, right, P. And there was nothing. I wasn't there at all. And what had happened was, I met him in 1983, and the book finished in 1982. It was the first volume. But reading it, I just thought, wow, this is really interesting. And it's exactly the same as anything else I've done. A carefully researched, factual drama, which is funny. That was my take on it. It was the things that happened in it happened, and we spent, he and I, hours and hours and hours going through it and working out a coherent structure. So it was a labour of love, really. It was like it seemed to grow. We started to work on it, and it was one of those things where it didn't feel like work. So it does fit in more than maybe you think into the rest of the stuff that I've done, in that it was the same process as researching Mrs. Biggs or Cilla or whatever.
Okay, excellent. Would anybody like to ask any more questions? I have one or two myself, but is there anybody? No, I'm just looking at the sea of faces looking back.
There's one.
There's one. Aha. Right in the middle. If you keep your arm up just for a minute so we can see where you are, that's it. We'll get the microphone to you.
Hey, Jeff, could you go through the process of rewriting?
Yeah, good question. Just out of interest, how many here, show of hands, would feel that their ambitions lay in writing? Okay, and producers? Directors? Very evenly spread. Other? Oh, okay. So these cameraman, camerawoman, sound, that kind of thing. Is that? Would that be the other? I'm guessing. Sorry, you can't.
Yeah,
no
I was going to say we can't really.
Stupid
Yes,
question.
Yeah.
Right. Rewriting. Writing is rewriting. Is the answer. I've learned over the years. I would do 15 drafts of something minimum between first draft and filming. You're rewriting. I believe you should be rewriting right up until action, and even then, sometimes in between the first take and the sixth take, something can be tweaked. But there are a couple of things I want to say about writing as well. I'm not. My character is not an arrogant. I hope no one thinks that I come across that way, but not to be an arrogant person. I'm not an arrogant person, and yet the writers out there, and I guess the producers and the directors as well, embrace arrogance, because you're saying, as a writer, the people in this scene, I want them to say that. The story, it's that, then that, then that. Now, that is intrinsically an arrogant thing, isn't it? As a director, you're saying, don't put the camera there, I want to put the camera there. Like, I don't know if anyone's seen Ida, won the Oscar for the foreign language film. It's an interesting film if you watch it. He Pavel Pawlikowski puts the camera, like the frame is there in the bottom of the frame. There's like the head and then a huge frame above them. And I watched it and it didn't put me off, but it was intriguing. And I found out subsequently that he had this, what he did was, the more they knew, it was a mystery about what had happened, the more they knew about what happened, gradually the frame, they filled the frame more. Just came across to me as really interesting framing, like when Quentin Tarantino, these are going to be the only two examples, I'm not a director, he put the camera right on the floor as someone walks through the door, so that you've got the whole of the door as they walk away through the door. And things just, but there's an arrogance to it. It's, as a producer, I think you should be interested in this story, and a big audience is going to watch this story. So embrace that arrogance. Doesn't mean, I'm not saying be an arrogant person, but don't sort of let a modesty or a indecisiveness or a politeness creatively get in the way of that arrogance that you need. You asked about writing. Yeah, writing is rewriting. So you'll come up with this is my process. You'll come up with a draft, and now this is going to sound counterintuitive. No, that's right. That's the point I was trying to make. So you've come up with a draft. I suppose you have to try and find people that you trust to give you feedback on the piece you've written. But and you shouldn't be afraid of getting feedback. It's a truism that you only want to hear this is brilliant, and it's harder to hear the second half doesn't work. But the more that you get reaction to what you've written, the more it's going to knock the rough edges off. And then comes the arrogance, because the arrogance is to get to a point where confidence and arrogance meet, where you're saying, okay, I've heard lots of notes. Never be frightened of notes. I've got lots of notes. Okay, I like that note. That one's rubbish. I'm not interested in that. But there's something in that, and that's interesting. So I'm just going to concentrate on that, not that, but that. But even if that note, you don't agree with it, at least you're asking questions of the script all the time. Every bit of it, you say, why that? Why not that? Don't be afraid of that process. And don't think that you pressed save and that draft is sacrosanct, because it's not. And it shouldn't be, and it should be open. It should be controlled by you as the writer, of course. We're into another whole world if the producer's rewriting your draft and you're not part of that process. I mean, that's kind of disaster. But yeah, as a writer, if you're right up until the point that they're filming it, I certainly wouldn't shut my mind to the idea of improving it.
I think that's an excellent tip. Do you have any other tips you can offer? Because these people are about to embark into the world that you know very well. Do you have any other? Yeah,
well, I'm talking. I'm sorry for the others, because I can't. I'd be guessing, but certainly for the producers, writers, and directors amongst you out there, ideas are king. It's an ideas industry, and so if you can, I'm trying to think of a way of expressing it. If you can come up with an idea and convince somebody that this I was on a forum recently with what was the miners' strike and the gays, Pride. Thank you. The guy that wrote Pride was an actor, so I suppose he had some foot in the industry. But he came across this story and he thought, this is really interesting. The fact that a lot of miners and kind of gay pride joined together, and that you couldn't think of a more incongruous relationship. And he had this idea, and he batted away and batted away. And he refused to give up on it. And finally, he found a producer who was intrigued and backed him enough to write a draft. And so the point I'm trying to make is, if he'd have, it's much more difficult as a writer, if you're going to, starting out as a writer, to get a commission, isn't it? It's to say, I suppose that you can say, I've written stuff, here's an example of what I can do. But much more powerful is to be like the Pride guy and say, I've got this idea, and I've met everybody, and I know how I do the story. So ideas are king, and constantly go through that process of, and don't just put it all into one, because if that one doesn't happen, as I said earlier, it's devastating. It's devastating. It's happened to me, which is why I now have them. But you have this family of ideas. I'd say at your stage, a good sort of 2, 3, 4 ideas that you think that excite you, and that would be for me the core. That's the entree. It's through ideas. It's much more difficult to be a writer for hire and get a commission. It's not. I mean, it's not. So many great writers of Carolyn's worked with when she was working on Coronation Street. I mean, Jack Rosenthal worked on Coronation Street as well, didn't he?
Indeed.
And that's a brilliant grounding. There's brilliant writers that have come out of EastEnders and Coronation Street and Hollyoaks and Brookside, which is an old one that doesn't exist now. But that was Jimmy McGovern, wasn't it, Brookside?
Indeed.
Yeah. And that's a great grounding, because you get to deal with the emotions and the situations and the drama of everyday life in a very quick turnaround. It's a murder this week, and it's a divorce the next week, and it's my teenage daughter's got pregnant, and whatever. So
no, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's so I hope everybody scribble down ideas are king, because it is true, and you need to have a balance of several going up at one time, don't you, so you can get the timing right. I mean, we could carry on this conversation for much, much longer. It's so frustrating that we only have this amount of time, but unfortunately we have now run out. So I must say thank you to Jeff for a wonderful insight into the industry.